My name is Clara Evelyn Hayes, and the day my son called me Deadweight was the day I realized I'd been carrying a family that no longer saw me. I was 68 years old, standing in the kitchen I'd scrubbed for decades, the same kitchen where I'd bandaged his scraped knees and baked his birthday cakes. The air smelled of the lemon cleaner I'd used that morning, and the sunlight spilled through the window, catching the dust motes that danced like memories. Daniel stood there, his arms crossed his eyes cold, and said, "Mom, you're just dead weight. We don't need you dragging us down anymore." His wife Laura stood behind him. Her lips pursed her silence louder than his words. I felt my heart crack. Not like glass, but like an old tree branch, heavy with years snapping under a weight it could no longer bear. I didn't cry then. I wanted to, oh, how I wanted to let the tears spill, to let them see the hurt they'd carved into me. But I stood still, my hands gripping the edge of the counter, the cool linoleum grounding me. I'd spent my life holding things together first for my husband, Tom. God rest his soul, and then for Daniel, my only child. When Tom passed 10 years ago, the grief was a quiet storm, but I weathered it. I sold our little hardware store, paid off the house, and made sure Daniel had a start in life. I never told him how much I'd sacrificed, how many nights I'd lain awake worrying about the bills, or how I'd skipped my own comforts to keep him fed and clothed. A mother doesn't boast about her love. She just gives it. Daniel was 42, now married to Laura for 15 years, with 2 children of their own, my grandchildren, Sophie and Liam. I adored them, those bright-eyed little ones, and I thought my place in their lives was secure. I lived in the house I'd shared with Tom, the same house where Daniel grew up, and I'd welcome them all to stay when Laura lost her job 2 years back. I didn't ask for rent, didn't ask for thanks. I paid the electric bill when it came covered. The water even slipped money into their account when Daniel's contracting business hit a rough patch. I thought I was helping, thought I was needed. But that word dead weight told me I was wrong. I looked at Daniel searching for the boy who used to cling to my skirt, the boy who'd cry when I left for the market. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who saw me as a burden, an outdated piece of furniture to be pushed aside. Laura's silence stung just as much. She'd never warmed to me, always kept her distance, but I'd hoped time would soften her. I'd mended Sophie's dresses, baked Liam's favorite cookies, and stayed up late listening to Laura's complaints about her old boss. I thought I was family. But in that moment, I saw the truth to them. I was just an old woman taking up space. "Daniel," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "What do you mean by that?" I wanted him to take it back, to laugh it off, to say he didn't mean it. But he didn't. He shifted his weight, glanced at Laura, and said, "Mom, we're trying to move forward. This house, your stuff, your presence, it's holding us back. We need to sell this place, get a fresh start. You could move into that senior home on Maple Street. It's nice there." Nice. The word landed like a slap. Maple Street was where people went when no one wanted them anymore, where they sat in faded armchairs staring at walls that smelled of antiseptic. I'd visited friends there, seen their eyes dim with resignation. I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't ready to be tucked away like an old quilt forgotten in a cedar chest. I looked around the kitchen at the chipped teapot Tom had loved, at the curtains I'd sewn when we first moved in. This house wasn't just walls and a roof. It was my life, my love, my history, and they wanted to sell it to erase me. "This is my home," I said, my voice trembling now. "I own it. I paid for it. You can't just decide." Mom Laura cut in, her voice sharp. "We're not saying you don't matter, but let's be practical. You're not getting any younger. You don't need all this space. We're thinking of you." Her eyes didn't meet mine, and I knew she didn't believe her own words. Practical. That was their excuse, their way of dressing up selfishness as concern. I wanted to scream, to tell them I'd been paying their way, that without me, they'd have lost this house to the bank last year. I wanted to throw the truth in their faces, that I'd been the one keeping the lights on, the one making sure Sophie had new shoes, the one covering the gap when Daniel's clients didn't pay on time. But I didn't. Something in me held back some stubborn pride, or maybe fear that they'd hate me more if they knew. So I just knotted my throat tight and said, "I'll think about it." That night, I sat in my bedroom, the one I'd shared with Tom for 35 years. His side of the bed was still empty, the pillow untouched. I opened the drawer of my nightstand and pulled out the little ledger I kept, the one where I tracked every payment, every transfer, every dollar I'd funneled into their lives. Page after page of numbers, proof of my love, proof I wasn't dead weight. I traced my finger over the entries, the ink smudging under my touch. I'd never told them, never wanted them to feel indebted. But now I wondered if that had been my mistake. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest. I heard Daniel and Laura downstairs, their voices low, planning their future without me. I heard Sophie's giggle, Liam's footsteps, and my heart ached for them. I didn't want to lose them. Didn't want to be the grandmother they visited once a month out of duty. But I couldn't stay here, not like this, not as a ghost in my own home. The next morning, I made coffee, same as always, and set out cereal for the kids. Daniel barely looked at me as he grabbed his keys, muttering about a job site. Laura was on her phone, scrolling her coffee untouched. I watched them, my son and his wife, and felt like a stranger. Sophie hugged me before school, her arms quick but warm, and Liam waved his smile shy. They were the only ones who still saw me, and even that felt fragile, like a thread about to snap. I spent the day cleaning, not because it needed it, but because it was what I knew. I dusted the mantel, polished the silver frame that held Tom's photo, and swept the porch, where we used to sit on summer nights. Every task was a prayer, a plea to understand what I'd done wrong, why my love wasn't enough. By afternoon, I was exhausted, my hands trembling as I folded laundry. That's when I founded a brochure for the Maple Street Senior Home, tucked under a pile of Daniel's shirts. Glossy paper smiling faces, promises of vibrant living. They'd already been planning measuring my life for a box. I sat on the edge of the couch, the brochure in my lap, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet, but a quiet resolve, like the first stir of wind before a storm. I wasn't dead weight. I wasn't done. I'd given everything to this family, and they'd taken me for granted. But I wasn't invisible, and I wasn't going to let them erase me. That evening, I called my old friend Ruth, the only person who'd known me before I was a wife, a mother, a widow. Ruth was 70 sharp as ever, living in a little apartment downtown. We hadn't spoken in months, not because of any falling out, but because life pulls you apart when you're not looking. "Clara," she said, her voice warm through the phone. "What's wrong?" And just like that, the dam broke. I told her everything, Daniel's words, Laura's coldness, the brochure. I cried the kind of crying that leaves you hollow but clean. Ruth listened, didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes. When I finished, she said, "Clara, you're not dead weight. You're the roots of that family, and they've forgotten how to see you. Come stay with me for a bit. Clear your head." I hesitated, glancing around the house at the life I'd built. But then I thought of that brochure of Daniel's eyes, and I said, okay. I packed a small bag that night, just enough for a few days. I left a note on the kitchen table. "Gone to visit Ruth. Back soon." I didn't say more, didn't owe them more. As I drove to Ruth's, the streetlights blurring through my tears, I felt something new stirring in me. Not hope, not yet, but a spark, a tiny ember of who I used to be. I didn't know what came next, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to let them bury me alive. The drive to Ruth's apartment felt like crossing a river I'd never meant to ford. The road stretched dark and quiet, the hum of my old sedan, the only sound besides my own uneven breaths. I was 68, and here I was, running away from my own home, a suitcase in the trunk, and a heart so heavy I thought it might sink me. Ruth lived in a modest brick building downtown, the kind with a buzzer that crackled, and a hallway that smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. When she opened her door, her silver hair caught the light, and her eyes, sharp as ever, softened when she saw me. "Clara," she said, pulling me into a hug that smelled of chamomile tea and memories. "You're here. That's enough for now." I stepped inside, and the weight of the day settled into my bones. Ruth's apartment was small, but a live book stacked on every surface, a quilt her mother had made draped over the couch, and a kettle whistling softly on the stove. It was the opposite of my house, which felt like a museum to a life I no longer lived. Ruth didn't ask questions right away. She poured tea, handed me a mug, and sat across from me, her hands folded like she was waiting for a story to unfold. I didn't know where to start, so I just sipped the tea, the warmth spreading through me like a small kindness. "I don't know what I'm doing, Ruth," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've given them everything, my time, my money, my heart, and they look at me like I'm nothing." The words tasted bitter, like medicine I hadn't wanted to swallow. Ruth leaned forward, her eyes steady. "You're not nothing, Clara. You're the woman who kept Tom's business afloat when he got sick, who raised a boy on her own after he was gone. You're the one who never broke even when life tried to break you. They've forgotten that, but you don't have to." Her words were a lifeline, but they also stung. I had forgotten, hadn't I? Somewhere along the way, I'd let myself shrink, let my world narrow to Daniel's needs, Laura's complaints, the grandchildren's laughter. I'd stopped seeing myself as Clara, the woman who'd once dreamed of painting, who'd laughed with Tom under the stars, who'd balanced the books with a pencil and a prayer. I was just Mom Grandma, the one who paid the bills and stayed quiet. Deadweight. That night, I slept on Ruth's pull-out couch, the springs creaking under me. I dreamed of my old garden, the one I'd tended before Tom died, where roses bloomed red and fierce. In the dream, the roses were wilted, their petals falling, but there was a single bud, small and stubborn, pushing through the dirt. I woke with tears on my cheeks, the image lingering like a promise I didn't yet understand. The next morning, Ruth made oatmeal and we sat at her tiny table, sunlight streaming through a window that overlooked the street. People passed below, young couples, an old man with a cane, a woman pushing a stroller. Life moving on without me. "What now, Clara?" Ruth asked, her voice gentle but firm. I didn't have an answer, but I knew I couldn't go back to that house, not yet, not as the woman they'd made me feel I was. "I need to think," I said. "I need space." Ruth nodded like she'd expected it. "Stay as long as you need," she said. "But don't hide here. Go out, walk. Remember who you are." It sounded so simple, but it felt impossible. Who was I if not Daniel's mother, Tom's widow, the one who kept the lights on? That afternoon, I took Ruth's advice and walked. The town hadn't changed much in the years I'd lived there. Same drugstore, same bakery, same park where I'd pushed Daniel on the swings. But it felt different now, like I was seeing it through new eyes. I wandered into the park, my shoes crunching on the gravel path. The swings were empty, swaying slightly in the breeze, and I sat on a bench watching leaves skitter across the grass. I thought of Daniel, of the way he'd looked at me, and the ache in my chest flared again. But then I thought of Sophie and Liam, their hugs, their laughter, and I wondered if they'd miss me, if they'd even notice I was gone. A woman sat down beside me, her coat a soft gray, her hair tucked under a scarf. She looked about my age, maybe a little older, and she smiled like we'd known each other forever. "Nice day," she said, her voice warm. I nodded, not trusting my own. "You look like you're carrying the world," she added, not unkindly. I laughed a small, broken sound. "Feels like it," I said. Her name was Helen, and she was 72, a retired librarian who came to the park every day to read. She didn't pry, but there was something about her, maybe the way her eyes crinkled, or the way she listened without rushing me, that made me talk. I told her about Daniel, about the word that had cut me open, about the house I loved, and the family that didn't. She listened, nodding, her hands folded around a paperback in her lap. When I finished, she said, "You know, my daughter once told me I was too old to matter. I believed her for a while, but then I realized she didn't get to decide my worth. Only I do." Her words stayed with me like a seed planted in soft earth. I walked back to Ruth's, my steps a little lighter. my mind churning. Helen didn't know me, but she'd really seen me in a way Daniel and Laura hadn't in years. That night, I sat with Ruth's old photo albums flipping through pictures of my life. There I was young and laughing, my hair long and dark, Tom's arm around me. There I was, holding baby Daniel, my face tired but radiant. There I was standing in my garden roses blooming behind me. I wasn't dead weight then, and I wasn't now. The next few days I fell into a rhythm at Ruth's. I helped her cook, watered her plants, listened to her stories about her days as a nurse. I went back to the park hoping to see Helen again, and we talked more about books about loss, about the way time changes you, but doesn't erase you. She told me about a community center downtown where people our age gathered for classes, for coffee, for company. "You should come," she said. "It's not about filling time. It's about finding yourself again." I wasn't ready, not yet, but the idea stuck. I started to notice things about myself I'd forgotten, like how I hummed when I washed dishes, or how I still knew every word to the songs Tom and I used to dance to. One morning, I found myself sketching on a napkin a rough outline of a rose, and I realized I hadn't drawn in years. It wasn't good, not like the paintings I'd done in my 20s, but it was mine, and that felt like a start. Meanwhile, I hadn't heard from Daniel or Laura. Not a call, not a text. I checked my phone, half expecting a message from Sophie or Liam, but there was nothing. It hurt, but it also clarified something. They didn't need me, not the way I'd thought. And maybe I didn't need them to define me either. One evening, Ruth and I were sipping wine on her tiny balcony, the air cool and sharp. She looked at me, her eyes glinting with mischief. "Clara, what's the one thing you've always wanted to do but never did?" I laughed, caught off guard. "I don't know," I said. "Paint, maybe, or travel. I always wanted to see Paris." Ruth raised her glass. "Then do it. You're not dead, Clara, you're just beginning." I went to bed that night, Ruth's words echoing Helen's voice, mingling with them. I thought of my ledger still in my suitcase, the one that held the truth about what I'd done for Daniel's family. I hadn't looked at it since I'd left, hadn't wanted to face the numbers that proved my love. But now I wondered if it was time to stop hiding, not just from them, but from myself. The next morning, I pulled the ledger out, my hand steady. I flipped through the pages, the entries stark and undeniable. Thousands of dollars year after year, keeping them afloat. I wasn't dead weight. I was their foundation, and they didn't even know it. For the first time, I felt a spark of anger, not the burning kind, but the quiet, resolute kind that pushes you forward. I didn't know what I'd do with that truth, but I knew I couldn't carry it alone anymore. I closed the ledger and looked out Ruth's window at the world moving on. I wasn't ready to confront Daniel, not yet, but I was ready to start living for me. And that I realized was the first step toward reclaiming the woman I'd always been. The days at Ruth's began to feel like a new kind of home, not the kind built of walls and history, but of small moments that reminded me I was still alive. I woke each morning to the smell of coffee, to Ruth's soft humming, as she watered her geraniums, to the sound of the world outside her window, cars humming, birds, calling life, insisting on itself. I was 68, and for the first time in years, I felt the stir of something I'd thought was lost myself. But the ache of Daniel's words, of Laura's silence, of the family I'd poured my heart into, never quite left me. It sat in my chest, heavy, but no longer crushing like a stone I was learning to carry. I started going to the park every day, not just to see Helen, though her company was a gift, but to feel the air on my face, to hear the rustle of leaves, to remind myself that the world was bigger than my kitchen. Helen and I would sit on that same bench, sometimes talking, sometimes just watching the squirrels dart across the grass. She'd bring her paperback and I'd bring a notebook, one I'd bought on impulse at the drugstore. I'd sketch in it. Nothing grand, just roses, leaves, the curve of a swing. My hands were clumsy at first, the lines shaky, but each stroke felt like a conversation with the girl I used to be, the one who dreamed of art before life demanded other things. One afternoon, Helen looked at my sketch and smiled. "You've got a gift, Clara," she said. "Not just for drawing, but for seeing. You see the beauty in things people overlook." Her words landed softly like rain on parched ground. I hadn't thought of myself as someone who saw beauty not in years. I'd been too busy seeing Bill's laundry the needs of others. But Helen's voice, steady and sure, made me believe it just a little. I started to venture beyond the park. Ruth pushed me gently but firmly to try the community center Helen had mentioned. "You're not hiding anymore, Clara," she said one morning, handing me a flyer. "Go, meet people. You're not done making friends." I resisted at first, the thought of walking into a room full of strangers making my stomach twist. What would I say? That I was a widow whose son thought she was a burden, that I'd run away from my own home. But Ruth's eyes, sharp and kind, wouldn't let me argue. So I went. The community center was a low brick building with a sign that read, "Silver Connections," in cheerful blue letters. Inside, it smelled of coffee and fresh paint, and the hum of voices greeted me before I saw the faces. There were people my age and older, some in groups, some alone laughing, knitting, playing cards. A woman with a bright red scarf waved me over. "New face," she said, her voice warm. "I'm Joyce. Come sit." And just like that, I was part of something. Joyce was 71, a former school teacher with a laugh that filled the room. She introduced me to others: Marvin, who'd been a carpenter, Lila, who painted watercolors, and Sam, who told stories about his days as a jazz musician. They didn't ask for my life story, didn't pry, but they included me passing me a cup of tea, asking if I'd tried the lemon bars. There was a painting class starting that week, Joyce said, and before I could overthink it, I signed up. "Good for you," Helen said when I told her later, her eyes crinkling. "You're growing, Clara." Bit by bit. The painting class was taught by a woman named Diane, barely older than Daniel, with a calm voice and hands that moved like they knew the canvas by heart. She didn't care that my last painting was decades ago, didn't care that my brushes shook. "Just feel it," she said, and I tried. I painted roses, of course, their petals curling red and bold. The first one was terrible, the colors muddy, but Diane looked at it and said, "There's heart here. Keep going." So I did. Each stroke, each class felt like peeling back a layer of the woman I'd let fade. I wasn't just Clara, the mother, the widow, the one who paid the bills. I was Clara, who loved color, who saw the way light caught a petal, who laughed when Joyce spilled paint on her smock. I started to hum again old songs Tom and I used to dance to, and I noticed people smiling when I did. I was visible not as a burden, but as a person. But the shadow of home lingered. I'd been at Ruth's for 2 weeks now, and still no word from Daniel or Laura. I checked my phone every night, hoping for a message from Sophie or Liam, a sign they missed me. Nothing. I wondered if they'd even noticed I was gone, or if they were too busy planning their fresh start. The thought twisted in me, but I didn't let it pull me under. I was learning to stand on my own, even if my knees wobbled. One evening, I sat with my ledger again, the one I'd hidden in my suitcase. I hadn't opened it since that first morning at Ruth's, but something drew me to it now. I flipped through the pages, the numbers stark under the lamplight. Electric bills, water bills, mortgage payments, Daniel's business loans, thousands of dollars year after year, funneled quietly from my savings, from the money I'd made selling Tom's store. I'd never told them, never wanted them to feel small. But now I saw it differently. I hadn't just kept the lights on. I'd kept their lives afloat, and they'd called me Deadweight. I closed the ledger, my hands steady, but my heart racing. I wasn't angry, not exactly, but I was awake. I thought of Helen's words about deciding my own worth. I thought of Ruth's question about what I'd always wanted to do. Paris, I'd said half joking. But now, the idea didn't feel so far away. I had money, not a fortune, but enough tucked away from years of careful saving. I'd spent so much on them, but there was still some for me. For Paris, for painting, for a life I hadn't dared imagine. The next day, I went to the library, a place I hadn't visited in years. I sat at a computer, the keys unfamiliar under my fingers, and searched for art classes in Paris. the screen filled with images, cobblestone streets, easels by the Seine galleries glowing under golden light. My heart quickened, not with fear, but with possibility. I printed a few pages, my hands trembling as I tucked them into my bag. It wasn't a plan, not yet, but it was a step. Back at the community center, I showed Joyce the pages, expecting her to laugh. Instead, she clapped her hands. "Clara, you have to go. Imagine it painting in Paris, eating croissants, living." Her excitement was contagious, and for the first time, I let myself dream without guilt. I wasn't abandoning anyone. I was choosing myself. That night, I wrote in my notebook not a sketch this time, but words. "I am Clara Evelyn Hayes," I wrote. "I am not dead weight. I am not done." The words felt like a vow, quiet but unbreakable. I thought of Daniel, of Laura, of the house they wanted to sell. I thought of the ledger, the truth they didn't know. And I realized something: I didn't have to tell them, not yet. I didn't have to prove anything to them, but I could prove it to myself. The next morning, I called a lawyer, an old friend of Tom's named George. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but his voice was as kind as I remembered. "Clara," he said, "what's on your mind?" I took a breath and told him I wanted to look at my finances, my will, the deed to the house. "I need to know my options," I said. He didn't ask why, just said, "Come by tomorrow. We'll sort it out." As I hung up, I felt a weight lift, not all of it, but enough to breathe. I went to the park that afternoon, my notebook in hand. Helen was there reading as always. She looked up and smiled. "You're different today," she said. "Lighter." I laughed a real laugh and told her about Paris, about the lawyer, about the vow I'd written. She reached for my hand, her grip warm and strong. "That's it, Clara," she said. "That's how you start again." I didn't know what would happen next. Didn't know if I'd go to Paris or stay. Didn't know if Daniel would ever see me. But I knew I wasn't invisible anymore, not to Helen, not to Joyce, not to myself. And that was enough for now. The meeting with George the lawyer felt like stepping into a room I'd forgotten existed. His office was small, tucked above the bakery downtown, the air carrying the faint sweetness of fresh bread. George was older than I remembered, his hair fully white now, but his handshake was firm, and his eyes held the same quiet understanding I'd trusted when Tom was alive. I sat across from him, my hands folded in my lap, the ledger tucked in my purse, like a secret I wasn't ready to share. "Clara," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you look good. Different." I smiled, though it felt fragile. "I'm trying to be," I said. I told him I wanted to understand my position, my finances, the house, the will I'd written years ago when Daniel was still a boy. I didn't mention the word Deadweight, didn't tell him about the brochure for Maple Street, or the way Laura's silence had cut deeper than Daniel's words. But George seemed to sense it the way old friends do, and he didn't push. He pulled out files, spread papers across his desk, and walked me through the numbers with a patience that made me feel seen. The house was mine, free and clear, the mortgage paid off with the sale of Tom's store. I'd known that, of course, but hearing it again, seeing the deed with my name, Clara Evelyn Hayes, felt like a reclamation. My savings were modest, but steady enough to live on enough for Paris if I chose it. The will, though, surprised me. I'd left everything to Daniel with provisions for Sophie and Liam, assuming that was what mothers did. But now, staring at those words, I felt a pang. Why had I never considered myself in that equation? George watched me, his pen tapping softly. "You can change it, Clara," he said. "It's your life, your legacy. You get to decide." I knotted my throat tight. I didn't want to cut Daniel out, not entirely, but I wanted to protect myself, to honor the woman I was becoming. "Can we add something?" I asked. "A trust maybe for the grandchildren, and something for me." George smiled like he'd been waiting for me to say it. "We can do that," he said. "Let's talk it through." We spent an hour sketching out ideas: a trust for Sophie and Liam's education, a small fund for my own dreams, a clause ensuring the house couldn't be sold without my consent. It wasn't about punishment. It was about boundaries, about claiming my place in a story I'd let others write. As I left George's office, the papers signed and filed, I felt a quiet strength, like a tree remembering its roots after a long winter. Back at Ruth's, I told her about the meeting, about the trust, about the house. She poured us wine, her eyes gleaming. "That's my Clara," she said, raising her glass. "You're not just surviving, you're building." I laughed, the sound surprising me. Building. I hadn't thought of it that way, but she was right. Each choice, each step was a brick in a new foundation, one that didn't depend on Daniel's approval or Laura's acceptance. The painting classes at the community center became my sanctuary. I went twice a week, my brushes steadier now, my roses taking shape, with petals that curled and glowed. Diane, the teacher, would stand behind me, nodding. "You're finding your voice, Clara," she said one day, and I felt a warmth spread through me. My voice. I'd spent so long speaking for others, Tom, Daniel, the grandchildren, that I'd forgotten what mine sounded like. But there it was, in the red of a petal, the shadow of a leaf, the way my hand moved without fear. Joyce and the others at the center became my anchors. We'd linger after class, sharing stories over coffee, laughing about the past, dreaming about the future. Marvin told me about his woodworking, how he'd started carving again after his wife passed. Lila showed me her watercolors, delicate scenes of the ocean she'd loved as a child. Sam played his saxophone one evening, the notes low and soulful, and I closed my eyes remembering Tom's hand in mine as we danced. These people, strangers turned friends, saw me not as a mother or a widow, but as Clara, the woman who painted, who listened, who was starting to live again. I still thought of Daniel, of course. The silence from home was a wound that hadn't healed, though it hurt less now. I wondered what they were doing, if they'd noticed the bills piling up, if Sophie and Liam asked where I was. I wanted to call to hear their voices, but something held me back. Not anger, but a need to protect this fragile new self, to let her grow before facing the weight of their indifference. One morning, I went to the park and found Helen waiting a new book in her hands. She looked at me, her scarf fluttering in the breeze, and said, "You're glowing, Clara." "What's changed?" I told her about the lawyer, the paintings, the friends I'd made. I told her about Paris, how it wasn't just a dream anymore, but a possibility, a plan I was sketching out with brochures and budgets. She listened, her smile widening, and when I finished, she said, "You're not just finding yourself. You're becoming someone new." Her words stayed with me, turning over in my mind as I walked back to Ruth's. Becoming someone new. I wasn't erasing the old Clara, the one who'd loved Tom, raised Daniel, tended roses, but I was adding to her, weaving new threads into the tapestry of my life. That afternoon, I sat at Ruth's table with my notebook, not sketching this time, but writing. I listed things I wanted, small things like new paints, a better easel, big things like a trip to Paris, a garden of my own again. It felt indulgent, almost selfish, but I kept writing, letting the words flow until the page was full. That evening, Ruth and I cooked dinner together, a simple meal of pasta and salad, but it felt like a celebration. We talked about her life, her years as a nurse, the patients she'd loved and lost. "You remind me of them, Clara," she said, her voice soft. "The ones who fought, who didn't give up. You're stronger than you know." I wanted to believe her, and for the first time, I think I did. The next day, I went to a travel agency, a little shop with posters of far-off places plastered on the walls. The woman behind the counter, young and bright-eyed, didn't blink when I said I wanted to plan a trip to Paris. She pulled out brochures, talked about art tours, museums, cafes by the river. I left with a folder full of options, my heart racing with something I hadn't felt in years, excitement. I didn't book anything, not yet, but holding those papers felt like holding a key to a door I'd thought was locked. Back at the community center, I showed Joyce the brochures and she squealed like a girl. "Clara, you're going to Paris. You have to send us postcards, paint the Eiffel Tower, fall in love with a French baker." We laughed, and for a moment, I forgot the weight of home, the silence of my phone, the ledger in my purse. I was just Clara dreaming big, surrounded by people who believed in me, but the ledger was still there, a quiet truth I couldn't ignore forever. One night alone in Ruth's apartment while she visited a neighbor, I opened it again. The numbers stared back a record of my love, my sacrifice. I thought of Daniel's business, how it had faltered until I'd stepped in, how I'd paid the loans, the suppliers, the rent on his office. I thought of the house, how I'd covered the taxes, the repairs, the bills they never saw. I wasn't dead weight. I was their lifeline. And they didn't know. I closed the ledger, my hands steady now. I didn't want to hurt them, didn't want revenge, but I wanted them to see me, to understand what I'd done, what I was. I didn't know how, not yet. But the thought of it, of standing in my truth, felt like a fire kindling inside me. I went to bed that night, the brochures on the table, my notebook open to a new page. I wrote one word, "Enough," and I knew in my bones that I was ready to mean it. The word "enough" stayed with me like a pulse beneath my skin, steady and sure. It wasn't loud or angry, but it was there, guiding me through the days that followed. I was 68, and I'd spent so long giving my time, my money, my heart, that I'd forgotten how to keep anything for myself. But now, with Ruth's apartment as my haven, with Helen's wisdom and Joyce's laughter, with the roses blooming on my canvas, I was learning. Not just to survive, but to thrive, to claim the space I'd let others fill. I started small the way you do when you're rebuilding. I bought new paints, vibrant reds and deep greens colors that felt alive. I replaced my old sneakers with a pair that didn't pinch, and I walked taller in them, my steps firmer on the park's gravel paths. I joined a book club at the community center, suggested by Lila, where we read novels about women who defied the odds. Women like me, I realized, who found their strength late, but found it all the same. Each choice, no matter how small, was a stitch in the fabric of a new Clara one who wasn't defined by Daniel's words or Laura's silence. The painting classes grew more precious to me. Diane, the teacher, started giving me harder assignments, shadows, textures, compositions that stretched my skills. One day she asked us to paint something that scared us. I hesitated, my brush hovering over the canvas. What scared me, not Paris. Not the future, not even the silence from home. What scared me was being forgotten, being invisible, being the woman they'd tucked away in their minds as dead weight. So I painted a figure, a woman alone in a garden, her face turned to the sky roses at her feet. The colors were bold, the lines fierce, and when I finished, Diane touched my shoulder. "That's you, Clara," she said. "That's your fire." The painting hung in the community center for a week, part of a small exhibit. Joyce and Marvin came, and so did Helen, who brought a thermos of tea and sat with me watching people pause at my work. A man I didn't know, maybe 80, with a cane and a tweed cap, stopped longest. "This one's got soul," he said, his voice rough but kind. I felt my cheeks warm, not with embarrassment, but with pride. My painting, my story was seen. I was seen. But the ledger, that quiet truth, still waited. I carried it in my purse now, not as a burden, but as a reminder. I'd stopped checking my phone for messages from Daniel or Laura, stopped hoping for Sophie's giggle or Liam's shy wave. 3 weeks had passed since I'd left, and their silence was an answer, one I was learning to accept. I didn't hate them, didn't wish them ill, but I was done waiting for their approval, done letting their blindness dim my light. One morning, I went back to George's office, the lawyer who'd helped me see my worth in numbers. I wanted to take another step to solidify the boundaries I'd started to draw. "Clara," he said, offering me a chair, "you've got that look again. What's next?" I smiled steadier now. "I want to make sure the house is protected," I said, "and I want to do something with my savings, something for me, but also something that lasts." We talked for hours, mapping out a plan. The house would stay in my name with a clause that it couldn't be sold or transferred without my consent, even after I was gone. The trust for Sophie and Liam was already in place, but I added a condition they'd receive it only if they maintained a relationship with me not out of duty but out of love. It wasn't about control. It was about teaching them what family meant, something their parents had forgotten. And for myself, I set aside a fund not huge, but enough for travel, for art, for the life I was daring to dream. George wrote it all down his pen, scratching softly, and when we finished, he looked at me with something like admiration. "You're rewriting your story, Clara," he said. "Not many do that." I left his office with a copy of the new documents, my purse heavier, but my heart lighter. On the way back to Ruth's, I stopped at a florist and bought a single red rose, its petals soft and perfect. I didn't know why not at first, but when I got to Ruth's, I placed it in a glass of water on the table next to my notebook. It wasn't just a flower, it was a symbol, a nod to the garden I'd lost, the one I was starting to rebuild inside myself. That evening, Ruth and I sat on her balcony, the air crisp with the promise of fall. She'd made soup thick with potatoes and herbs, and we ate slowly, savoring the warmth. "You're different, Clara," she said, her eyes searching mine. "Not just stronger, wiser. Like you found something." I nodded, sipping my tea. "I have," I said. "Me." The next day, I went to the travel agency again. This time, I didn't just browse. I sat with the same young woman, her enthusiasm undimmed, and booked a trip to Paris 6 weeks, starting in the spring with an art course and a room near the Seine. I paid the deposit with my own money, not the savings I'd used for Daniel's debts, but the fund I'd carved out for myself. As I signed the forms, my hand didn't shake. I was choosing me, and it felt like freedom. Back at the community center, I told Joyce and Lila, and they cheered like I'd won a prize. Paris Joyce said, hugging me, "You're going to come back a new woman," I laughed, but I didn't tell her I was already becoming one. That night, I painted again, not for class, but for myself. A Parisian street imagined from the brochures, with lamplights glowing and roses spilling from a window. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And that was enough. The ledger, though, was never far from my thoughts. I knew I'd have to face it to face them, Daniel, Laura, the truth of what I'd done. Not out of anger, but out of necessity to close the chapter they'd written and start my own. One afternoon, I sat in the park with Helen, the air cool, the leaves turning gold. I told her about the ledger, about the thousands I'd paid the life I'd kept afloat. She listened, her scarf fluttering, and when I finished, she said, "You don't owe them the truth, Clara, but you owe it to yourself. Tell them not to hurt them, but to free you." Her words settled in me clear and true. I didn't want to fight, didn't want to scream, but I wanted them to know, to see the woman they'd dismissed. I started to plan, not with vengeance, but with dignity. I'd go back to the house, not to stay, but to stand in my truth. I'd show them the ledger not as a weapon, but as a mirror reflecting the love they'd taken for granted. That night, I wrote in my notebook again, not a list this time, but a letter. Not to Daniel or Laura, but to myself. "Dear Clara," I wrote, "you are enough. You always were. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I read it aloud, my voice soft in Ruth's quiet apartment, and felt the words sink into my bones. I was ready not to confront, but to reveal, to step into the light I'd hidden from for too long. The next morning, I packed my bag not to leave Ruth's, but to prepare for a visit home. I didn't know what I'd find, didn't know if they'd listen or care, but I knew I'd speak not for them, but for me. I looked at the rose on the table, its petals still bright, and I smiled. I was Clara Evelyn Hayes, and I was done being invisible. The drive back to the house felt like crossing a bridge I'd built with my own hands, each mile a testament to the woman I was becoming. The road was familiar, past the drugstore, the park, the bakery where Tom used to buy me cinnamon rolls on Sundays, but it felt different now, as if I were seeing it through a clearer lens. My purse sat on the passenger seat, the ledger inside its weight, both a burden and a beacon. I wasn't going to fight, wasn't going to beg for their love. I was going to stand in my truth to let them see the Clara they'd forgotten, the one who'd kept their world from crumbling. I was 68 and the house loomed ahead, its white siding faded but sturdy, the porch swing creaking in the breeze. It was mine, not just in name but in every memory etched into its walls. Tom's laughter, Daniel's first steps, the roses I'd planted in the backyard. I parked in the driveway, my hands steady on the wheel, and took a breath. The air smelled of autumn, crisp and sharp, and I felt it fill me, grounding me for what came next. The front door opened before I could knock, and Sophie stood there, her eyes wide. "Grandma," she cried, throwing her arms around me. Her hug was fierce, her hair smelling of strawberry shampoo, and for a moment I was just her grandmother, not the woman carrying a ledger or a wound. Liam appeared behind her, shy but smiling, and I hugged him too, his small frame warm against mine. "Where were you?" Sophie asked, her voice a mix of joy and reproach. "We missed you." My heart ached at her words, but I smiled, brushing her hair back. "I missed you too, sweetheart," I said. "I was visiting a friend. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough for now." I stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards under my feet, and saw Laura in the kitchen, her back to me, chopping vegetables. Daniel wasn't there, and I felt a flicker of relief, though I knew I'd face him soon. Laura turned, her face tightening when she saw me. "Clara," she said, her voice clipped. "You're back." No warmth, no questions, just that flat tone like I was an inconvenience. I nodded, setting my purse on the counter. "Just for a visit," I said, keeping my voice even. She didn't reply, just went back to her chopping, the knife's rhythm sharp and deliberate. I wanted to ask where Daniel was, if they'd noticed the bills piling up, if they'd even cared that I was gone. But I held back, knowing this wasn't the moment. I spent the afternoon with Sophie and Liam, listening to their stories, school projects, soccer games, a new puppy they wanted. Their chatter was a balm, reminding me why I'd stayed, why I'd given so much. But it also sharpened my resolve. They deserved a grandmother who was whole, not a shadow diminished by their parents' disregard. When Laura called them for dinner, I excused myself, saying I needed to rest. She didn't argue, didn't invite me to stay. I went upstairs to my bedroom, the one I'd shared with Tom, and closed the door. The room was unchanged. The bed neatly made, Tom's watch still on the nightstand. I sat on the edge of the mattress, the ledger in my lap, and opened it. The numbers stared back, a map of my love: $3,000 for Daniel's business loan, $200 for the electric bill, $800 for Sophie's school trip. Page after page, proof I wasn't dead weight. I traced the entries, my finger lingering on the last one, a payment I'd made just before I left. I hadn't sent anything since, and I wondered if they'd noticed, if the lights had flickered, if the bank had called. I heard the front door open downstairs, Daniel's voice low and tired. My heart quickened, not with fear, but with purpose. I closed the ledger, slipped it back into my purse, and stood. I looked in the mirror at the woman staring back, gray hair, pulled back eyes, clear face-lined but strong. "You are enough," I whispered the words from my notebook, a vow I carried now. I went downstairs, ready to face them. Daniel was in the living room, loosening his tie, Laura beside him, her arms crossed. They looked up when I entered, their expressions guarded. Mom Daniel said, his voice neutral, "You're back." The same words as Laura, the same distance. I nodded, sitting on the couch, my purse beside me. "I've been staying with Ruth," I said. I needed some time. Laura's lips tightened, but Daniel just shrugged. "You could have told us," he said, like I'd inconvenienced him. I felt the old urge to apologize, to smooth things over, but I pushed it down. I left a note, I said, my voice calm. "But I'm here now. We need to talk." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Mom, if this is about the house, we've already discussed it. We need to sell. It's too much for you to manage." Laura nodded, her eyes on her phone, like this was a formality. I looked at them, my son and his wife, and felt a strange calm. They didn't see me, not really, but they would. "This isn't about the house," I said, reaching into my purse. I pulled out the ledger, its worn cover soft under my fingers, and placed it on the coffee table. It's about this. They glanced at it confused, and I opened it to the first page. The entries neat and undeniable. For years, I've been paying your way, I said, my voice steady. The mortgage, the utilities, your business loans, Sophie's trips, Liam's doctor visits, thousands of dollars every month from my savings. I never told you because I didn't want you to feel small, but I'm telling you now. Daniel's face changed, his eyes narrowing, then widening as he leaned forward, scanning the numbers. Laura put down her phone, her mouth opening slightly. What? What are you talking about? Daniel asked, his voice uncertain. I turned the pages, showing them the truth, dates, amounts, the quiet sacrifices they'd never seen. I paid the electric bill when you couldn't, I said. I covered the mortgage when the bank called. I kept your business afloat when your clients didn't pay. I wasn't Deadweight Daniel. I was your foundation. The room was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. Daniel stared at the ledger, his hands gripping the armrests. Laura's face flushed, her eyes darting to Daniel, then back to me. Why didn't you say anything? She asked, her voice sharp, almost accusing. I looked at her, my gaze steady. Because I loved you, I said. Because I thought you'd see me without me having to prove it. Daniel shook his head, his voice low. Mom, we didn't know. You should have told us. There was no apology, no softness, just that edge of blame, and it stung, but it didn't break me. I'm telling you now, I said. And I'm also telling you I've stopped. I haven't paid a bill since I left. You might want to check your accounts. Laura's eyes widened and she grabbed her phone, scrolling frantically. Daniel just sat there, his face a mix of shock and something else, guilt maybe, or resentment. I didn't care which. I'd said what I needed to say, not to hurt them, but to free myself. I stood the ledger in my hands and looked at them. This house is mine, I said. I've made sure it stays that way. You can stay for the kids' sake, but things are going to change. I'm not invisible anymore. I walked upstairs, my heart pounding, but light like a bird taking flight. Sophie peeked out of her room, her eyes worried. Grandma, are you okay? She asked. I smiled, kneeling to hug her. I'm more than okay, I said. I'm me. She hugged me back, and I knew whatever came next, I'd have her love and Liam's, and that was enough. That night, I slept in my own bed, Tom's watch glinting in the moonlight. I dreamed of roses not wilted but blooming their roots deep and strong. I woke, knowing I'd done what I needed to, not for them, but for me. And I was ready for whatever came next. The morning after I showed them the ledger, the house felt different, like the air had shifted, carrying a new current. I woke early, the dawn light filtering through the curtains, painting the room in soft grays. I was 68, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of my own presence, not as a shadow or a servant, but as Clara Evelyn Hayes, the woman who'd built this life and refused to let it be erased. I slipped on Tom's watch, its familiar weight grounding me, and went downstairs, ready to face whatever the day would bring. The kitchen was quiet, the coffee pot cold. Sophie and Liam were still asleep, their doors closed, but I heard low voices from the living room. Daniel and Laura, their tones hushed but urgent. I paused my hand on the counter, listening. How did we not know? Daniel was saying, his voice tight. The bank called yesterday, Laura. We're behind on everything. Laura's reply was sharp, clipped. She should have told us. How were we supposed to know she was paying? I felt a pang not of guilt, but of clarity. They were grappling with the truth I'd laid bare, and it wasn't my job to soften it for them. I made coffee, the familiar ritual, calming me, and sat at the kitchen table with my notebook. I didn't sketch or write, just sipped the coffee, letting the warmth spread through me. The ledger was upstairs, locked in my suitcase, but its truth was here in the air, undeniable. I'd stopped paying their bills, stopped being their silent savior, and now they were feeling the weight of their own choices. It wasn't revenge, it was reality, and I was done shielding them from it. Daniel came into the kitchen, his face drawn, his eyes avoiding mine. "Mom," he said, pouring himself coffee. "We need to talk." I nodded, closing my notebook. "I'm here," I said, my voice steady. He sat across from me, his hands wrapped around the mug, and for a moment I saw the boy he'd been uncertain needing me. But that boy was gone, and the man in front of me had to face the consequences of his words. Laura and we didn't know. He started, his voice low. "About the money, the bills, all of it. Why didn't you tell us?" There was no apology, just that question, and it stung. But I was ready. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to feel like you owed me," I said. "I did it because I loved you, because I wanted you to have a life without worry. But you called me Deadweight Daniel. You made me feel like nothing. I couldn't carry that anymore." He flinched, his eyes dropping to the table. "I didn't mean it like that," he said, but the words felt hollow, like an excuse he didn't fully believe. "We were just trying to move forward. The house, the business, it's been hard." I looked at him, my son, and felt a mix of love and resolve. "It's been hard for me too," I said. "But I didn't stop. I kept going for you, for Sophie, for Liam, until you told me I was a burden." Laura appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed her face, pale. "Clara." "We didn't know," she said, echoing Daniel, but her voice was sharper, defensive. "You can't just drop this on us and expect us to—" "What, thank you?" I met her gaze, unflinching. "I don't expect thanks," I said. "I expect respect. I expect you to see me not as an old woman in your way, but as the person who held this family together." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant sound of Sophie's laughter upstairs. Daniel rubbed his face, his shoulders slumping. "What now, Mom?" he asked. "You've stopped paying. The bank's calling. The business is— it's a mess." There was a plea in his voice, but I didn't rush to fill it. I'd spent years fixing their problems, and I was done. Now I said you figure it out. The house is mine, and I've made sure it stays that way. You can live here for the kids, but you'll pay your share, rent, utilities, whatever it takes. I'm not your bank anymore." Laura's eyes widened and she opened her mouth, but I held up a hand. "And I'm not moving to Maple Street. I'm not done living. I'm going to Paris in the spring to paint, to see the world. I've earned that." Daniel stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Laura's face hardened, but she didn't speak. I stood, my coffee mug in hand, and looked at them. "I love you," I said, my voice soft but firm. "But I love myself, too. And I'm not invisible anymore." I walked past them, up to my room, my heart pounding, but light, like I'd shed a weight I'd carried too long. That afternoon, I went to the community center, needing the warmth of Joyce, Lila, and the others. I told them what had happened, the ledger, the confrontation, the way Daniel and Laura had looked at me. Joyce hugged me, her arms strong. "You did it, Clara," she said. "You stood up for you." Lila nodded, her eyes bright. "You're not just surviving, you're shining." I smiled, feeling their words settle into me, filling the cracks Daniel's words had left. I painted that evening a new canvas, not roses this time, but a woman standing on a bridge, the Seine. Behind her, her face turned to the sky. It was me, or the me I was becoming, bold and free. Diane looked at it and said, "This is your best yet, Clara. It's alive." I felt it too, the life in it, the life in me. Life in. The next few days were quiet, the house a strange mix of tension and normalcy. Sophie and Liam clung to me, their hugs tighter, their questions softer. "Are you staying?" Grandma Liam asked one morning, his eyes wide. I kissed his forehead. "I'm here for you," I said. "Always." But I knew I wouldn't stay forever. Paris was waiting, and so was the life I was building. Daniel and Laura were different now, their voices quieter, their eyes avoiding mine. I heard them arguing at night about money, about the business, about me. I didn't eavesdrop, didn't need to. I'd given them the truth, and it was theirs to carry now. One evening, Daniel knocked on my door, his face tired. "Mom," he said, "can we talk?" I nodded, letting him in. He sat on the edge of my bed, his hands clasped. "I'm sorry," he said, the words heavy like they'd been stuck in him for years. I didn't see you. I didn't know what you were doing for us. I was wrong. It wasn't perfect, wasn't the apology I dreamed of, but it was real, and it was his. I looked at him, my son, and felt the love I'd always had tempered now with boundaries. I know I said, but it's not just about saying sorry. It's about seeing me every day as I am. He nodded, his eyes wet, and for a moment I saw the boy who'd needed me. "I'll try," he said. I believed him, not because I trusted him fully, but because I trusted myself to hold him to it. Laura never apologized, but her silence softened her sharpness, dulled. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a start. I went back to Ruth's the next day, needing her clarity, her strength. She listened as I told her everything, her eyes gleaming with pride. "You didn't just show them, Clara," she said. "You showed yourself." I nodded, feeling the truth of it. I'd faced them not with anger, but with dignity, and I'd walked away whole. That night I looked at my Paris brochures, the paintings I'd started, the notebook full of my dreams. I wasn't just Clara, the mother, the widow. I was Clara, the artist, the traveler, the woman who'd chosen herself. And I knew whatever came next, I'd face it with the same quiet strength that had brought me here. The days after Daniel's apology settled into a rhythm that felt both new and fragile, like a seedling pushing through soil, uncertain but alive. I was 68, and my house held me differently now, not as a cage, but as a place I could choose to stay or leave. I spent mornings with Sophie and Liam, their laughter a tether to the love that had always anchored me. Sophie would sit at the kitchen table drawing with crayons, her chatter filling the air, while Liam showed me his soccer tricks in the backyard. Their love was uncomplicated, a gift I cherished, but I knew it wasn't enough to define me. I was more than their grandmother, more than the woman who'd paid the bills or borne the weight of Daniel's words. I was Clara Evelyn Hayes, and I was writing my own story. I went back to Ruth's, often needing her sharp wisdom, her laughter, her balcony where we'd sip tea and watch the world move on. She'd listen as I talked about Daniel's apology, about Laura's softened silence, about the way the house felt both mine and not mine. "You've done the hard part, Clara," she said one evening, her eyes glinting in the twilight. "You've claimed yourself. Now you get to live it." Her words were a blessing, a permission I hadn't known I needed. I hugged her, my heart full, and knew I'd carry her with me wherever I went. The community center remained my sanctuary. I painted with Joyce and Lila, laughed with Marvin, and Sam shared tea with Helen when she joined us. My roses, my bridges, my imagined Parisian streets filled canvases, each one a step toward the woman I was becoming. Diane, the teacher, started talking about a local art show, a small event where we could display our work. "You should submit, Clara," she said, her voice firm. "Your paintings have something to say." I hesitated, the old fear of being seen creeping in. But then I thought of the man at the exhibit, the one who'd said my work had soul. I nodded, my heart racing. "I'll do it," I said, and Joyce cheered, her laughter echoing through the room. I chose the painting of the woman on the bridge, the one with the Seine behind her, her face turned to the sky. It wasn't perfect, but it was me, bold, free, alive. The show was set for a month before my Paris trip, and I spent weeks preparing, refining the edges, deepening the colors. Each brushstroke felt like a promise, not to the world, but to myself. I was enough, and I was going to show it. Daniel and Laura were trying in their way. They started paying the electric bill, the water, a small rent I'd set. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a sign they were learning to stand without me. Daniel would sit with me sometimes, awkward but earnest, asking about my painting, my plans. "Paris, huh?" he said one evening, his voice almost shy. "That's big." I nodded, smiling. "It is," I said, "but I'm ready." He didn't ask for forgiveness, again, didn't need to. His effort, small as it was enough for now. Laura was harder, her walls higher. She'd nod when I spoke, offer coffee, but her eyes still held a guarded edge. I didn't push, didn't need her love to feel whole. I'd learned that from Helen, from Ruth from the mirror that showed me a woman with gray hair and clear eyes. I loved her in my way, but I didn't need her to love me back. I had myself, and that was more than enough. The art show came a quiet affair in the community center's main hall with tables of cookies and punch fairy lights strung along the walls. My painting hung near the center, its frame simple but proud. Sophie and Liam came, their eyes wide, and Sophie hugged me, whispering, "That's you, Grandma." I kissed her forehead, my heart swelling. Daniel and Laura came too, standing awkwardly by the punch bowl, but they looked at my painting, and I saw Daniel's eyes linger, something like pride flickering there. It wasn't everything, but it was something, and I let it be. Helen was there, her scarf bright red, her smile warm. "You did it, Clara," she said, squeezing my hand. "You're not just painting, you're living." I hugged her, feeling the truth of it. The show wasn't about selling art or winning prizes. It was about standing in my light, letting the world see me. And they did, strangers, friends, my family, all pausing at my canvas, seeing the woman I'd become. As spring approached, I prepared for Paris. I packed light, just a suitcase with clothes, my notebook, a small set of paints. The trust for Sophie and Liam was secure. The house protected my savings, ready for this new chapter. I didn't know if I'd stay in Paris, if I'd come back to the house, or if I'd find another home somewhere else, but I knew I'd carry myself, my strength, my roses wherever I went. The day before I left, I went to the backyard, to the spot where my roses used to grow. The garden was overgrown, now neglected, but I saw it as it had been: red petals, green leaves, life. I knelt my hands in the dirt and planted a single rose bush, a gift from Joyce, its roots small but strong. It wasn't for Daniel or Laura, not even for Sophie and Liam. It was for me, a marker of the woman who'd bloomed again, against all odds. That night, I sat with Sophie and Liam, giving them each a small gift, a locket for Sophie with a tiny rose, engraving a watch for Liam, not Tom's, but one I'd chosen for him. "These are to remind you of me." I said, my voice soft, "not just as your grandma, but as Clara, who loves you and loves herself too." They hugged me, their arms tight, and I knew they'd carry me with them just as I'd carry them. I left the next morning, my suitcase in the trunk, Tom's watch on my wrist, the rose bush in the ground. Daniel drove me to the airport, his hands tight on the wheel. "Mom," he said as we pulled up, "I'm proud of you." The words were quiet, but they landed, and I smiled. "Thank you," I said. "I'm proud of me too." Laura waved from the porch as we left, her face unreadable, but I didn't need her approval anymore. I had my own. At the gate, I looked out at the plains, the sky wide and waiting. I thought of the ledger now tucked in a drawer, its truth spoken. I thought of Ruth, Helen, Joyce, the people who'd seen me when I couldn't see myself. I thought of the rose bush, its roots sinking deep. And I thought of Paris, the sin, the life I was stepping into. As I boarded the plane, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. I wasn't running from anything, wasn't chasing anything. I was simply living fully as Clara Evelyn Hayes. I took my seat, the window beside me, showing a world I was ready to meet. And as the plane rose, I whispered to myself, "Your worth isn't measured by who accepts you, but by how you choose to honor yourself." I closed my eyes, the rose bush in my mind, and knew I was home.